Good afternoon, folks. I thought I would take an opportunity here to follow up on that length limit video I posted about a week and a half ago, and give you guys a example of how length limits get changed and why they get changed and the process by which they get changed. This is a real life example on Lake Eufaula. It's a pretty good sized reservoir, relatively productive. Not all that deep, about 20 feet for a mean depth, fluctuates annually about 6 feet. It's kind of a run of the river reservoir on the Chattahoochee River between Georgia and Alabama. And like a lot of those reservoirs, it has more than one name. In Alabama, it is known as Lake Eufaula. In Georgia, it's known as Walter F. George Reservoir. This lake, regardless of what you call it, has a rich history of largemouth bass fishing and especially bass tournaments. It was here where an awful lot of the early BASS tournaments were held. Ray Scott lived in Montgomery, just an hour and a half away to the west of this lake. And also, this is the home place of Tom Mann, one of the early pioneers of black bass fishing and tournament fishing, and also lure development. He is the man behind the famous Mann's jelly worm, one of the original plastic worms produced in the United States. And so obviously this has been a tournament mecca for a long, long time. In about 20, 30 years ago, Alabama had a program to attract big tournaments to the state, and they built large facilities and ramps to host major tournaments in about 6 or 7 of their bigger reservoirs across the state, including Lake Eufaula. This particular one is at Lake Point State Park, right outside of the city of Eufaula, Alabama. So, background about what was going on. In the late 1980s and the early 1990s, harvest was about 30% a year. That seems unimaginably high to us today, but this is what it used to be like in the old days. People like to keep and eat fish. So this is not that unusual, actually. Catch and release rate was about 50%. So if a bass made it to the boat or to the bank, it had about a 50-50 shot of going in the cooler. Recruitment in this reservoir is variable. Strong year classes are produced about every 3 years, and research has shown that really is tied to the timing and magnitude of the shad spawning. Growth rates were high. Took about 2 years for largemouth bass to reach 12 inches and a little over 4 years to reach 16 inches. That's really, really fast growth. And modeling at the time suggested that the number of fish reaching 16 inches would probably double if they had a 16-inch minimum, because harvest was that high and natural mortality rate was relatively low. And so therefore that limit was enacted in June of 1992. Prior to that, there was no limit on this lake, although most tournaments at least were enforcing a 12-inch minimum. So things change. Things always change in nature, and we have to be adept to respond to those changes. So by the late 1990s, which was really only a decade, okay, it's really amazing how fast the catch and release phenomenon swept over the country. But harvest in this reservoir was now less than 10%, some perhaps as low as 5% a year. And catch and release rate went from 50% to 90%. So a bass getting caught in the late 90s had a really good chance of avoiding the cooler and going back into the lake. Recruitment was still exactly the same pattern, tied to the shad spawning, but the growth rates had slowed. It now took 2.5 years to reach 12 inches, and it took almost 5 years to reach 16 inches. And to make matters worse, in the mid-1990s, one of the first and most severe cases of largemouth bass virus was detected in this reservoir and basically wiped out all of the big fish in the lake. Needless to say, you have slower growth, fewer big fish, 16-inch minimum size limit, hard to weigh in any fish. your tournament use is going to go down. If you think about this from biological standpoint, the main differences that would affect how well that length limit was working would be a big drop in harvest, slower growth, perhaps due to lingering effects of LMBV. There was no change in total annual mortality. So if you think back about what we were talking about a week and a half ago, if you have a big drop in harvest and you don't see a change in total annual mortality, then what's happening to natural mortality? Well, it's increasing. So that's another area of concern right there. So if you think about what was going on here, this is a graphical depiction of this, and you look at natural mortality rates going across the bottom here. And so back in the old days, we were operating at about a 15% natural mortality rate. But now we think it's probably more like 25% and possibly as high as 30%. So under the no minimum length limit, the number of fish entering the fishery, in other words, let's just think of it from a tournament standpoint, the number of fish reaching 12 inches where they could be weighed in a tournament was about 70 fish out of 100, 70% of the fish. Now, under a much higher natural mortality rate and slower growth, that number is down to about 50. So that's a substantial drop. Of course, there's not a 12-inch minimum on this reservoir right now. There's a 16-inch minimum. So back when that 16-inch minimum was first enacted, back then with the lower natural mortality rate, you're looking about 50% of the age 1 recruits that entered the population were also reaching that 16-inch minimum. That's a really high number of fish, but we're not there anymore. We're now down here at high natural mortality rate and slower growth. And so instead of 50, it looks like it's more about 25. And that kind of shows why the tournaments were having such a hard time weighing in fish during the tournament, because about half as many were there as there had been in previous decades. And that was shown in the tournament data. Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources has a tournament collection program they call the BAIT program, Bass Angler Information Team. And you can see percent success under the no minimum size limit. And success was a tournament participant weighing in at least 1 fish, averaged about 70%. When they put the 16-inch minimum on it, it lowered down to, on average, about 50%. But you also notice in the late 90s, it started to trend downward because of that lack of big fish and the slower growth, and then LMBV as well. Likewise, you look at the number of fish caught per day, per tournament day. So out of a 5-fish limit, on average, folks were weighing in 3 under the no minimum. When they put the 16-inch minimum on there, it dropped to 1. That's starting to be in the land of discontent. That means an awful lot. And again, this is the on average, right? The average number caught per day. It means there's a lot of people that weren't weighing in anything. And that number started to also decline from 1 to below 1 in the late 1990s. And so there was a lot of concern from the tournament anglers about what was going on. Probably the worst metric was this, how long it takes to catch a 5-pound bass. And again, this is in a tournament. You look at the under no minimum length limit there, it took on average about 150 fishing hours to catch a 5-pound bass. When the 16-inch minimum length limit was enacted, that really didn't change any until LMBV hit. And it rapidly went from around 200 hours to 700 hours. And it got a little bit better at the end of the decade. It was only 600 hours to catch a 5-pound bass. I'm going to go out on a limb and say the fishing wasn't all that good on that reservoir back then. And again, a commensurate decline in the number of tournament anglers. It's interesting to look there at the late 1980s and see how that number is just going up and up and up. That I would suspect was a nationwide trend. The tournament angling was really catching fire in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and it kept going throughout the 1990s to where it is today. Look at what happened, though, under the 16-inch minimum. When they first enacted it, it went down from what it was, but it still was kind of holding steady. And then as soon as that LMBV hit, it just plummeted. And so there was a lot of concern in the town of Eufaula, Alabama, sitting on the shores of Lake Eufaula, not far from Lake Point State Park, where that big tournament ramp was. And so something had to be done here. If we wanted to continue to have people showing up and fishing Lake Eufaula, and more importantly to, the Chamber of Commerce and the political leaders spending money in Eufaula, Alabama, something had to be done. And so the question was, what if we lowered the limit to only 14-inch minimum? Would that be enough? Well, we're going to find that out in the next video when we get into the nitty-gritty of how we go about figuring out whether or not a 14-inch minimum size limit would solve the problems that we're facing the anglers and the town of Eufaula, Alabama with this high minimum length limit. So I hope you guys enjoyed what you were seeing today and learned something, and catch us next time to get the rest of the story. And we will see you then. Have a nice day.